The silver star weighs more than you'd think. Not the metal itself, that's surprisingly light, a bronze star on a ribbon of blue and white, small enough to fit in the palm of your hand. The weight comes later, in the quiet hours when you're alone in a hotel room 2 days before the ceremony, staring at 2 blank seat cards that are supposed to say family of the honoree, front row, 2 seats. I was 32 years old, an Army combat medic with 3 deployments and a chest full of ribbons that meant nothing to the people who gave me life. 3 weeks before they pinned that star on my uniform at the Pentagon, I stood in my parents' kitchen in Millbrook, Ohio, holding those 2 cards out like an offering. My father, Frank Farrell, didn't take them. He slid them back across the table with 2 fingers, like they were covered in something he didn't want on his hands. "You're this family's biggest shame," he said. "We'll never stand beside you." My mother, Carol, stood at the sink with her back to me, wiping a dry plate with a dish towel that hadn't touched water. She didn't turn around. She didn't say a word. I picked up the cards and said, "Okay." That word cost me nothing to say. It cost me everything to mean. I grew up learning that love was a transaction. My father measured worth by usefulness. He never said it out loud, he didn't have to. When I brought home an honor roll plaque at 8 years old, proud and grinning, he took it from my hands, studied it like it was a bill he didn't recognize, and locked it in a drawer. He told me that girls who show off embarrass their fathers. I learned to hide my achievements the way other children hide their failures. My mother taught me to keep my needs invisible. She was an expert at it herself. She could make herself so small in a room that you'd forget she was there, except for the constant motion of her hands. Dishes. Laundry. Dusting. Always moving, never speaking, as if stillness might draw attention she couldn't afford. My younger sister, Brittany, was the face of the family. Blonde, bubbly, effortlessly charming. Every school play, every dance recital, every photograph on the mantle, that was Brittany. She was celebrated for existing, while I was valued for what I could fix. I became the hands. I earned straight A's I never mentioned, completed chores before anyone could ask, and learned to anticipate needs like a radar dish pointed at my father's moods. I knew when he'd had a bad day at the shop by the way he set down his coffee mug. I knew when my mother was worried by the way she folded laundry, every crease sharp as a knife. The only place I didn't have to perform was Ruthie's. My Aunt Ruth, my mother's older sister, ran a diner on the edge of Millbrook. It was the kind of place where the coffee was always hot and the pie was always homemade and the regulars sat in the same booths they'd occupied for 30 years. I started going there when I was 8, telling my parents I was at the library. Every Saturday, I'd walk the mile from our house to Ruthie's, push open the screen door that whined on its hinges, and breathe in the smell of bacon grease and yeast and something that felt like safety. Ruth never asked why I came. She just fed me. She'd slide a plate of eggs and toast across the counter and say, "Sit down, eat, your family." Those 3 words, your family, meant something different at Ruthie's than they did in my parents' house. At Ruthie's, love came without conditions attached. Ruth hugged me without checking my grades first. She asked how I was doing and actually waited for the answer. She told me stories about my mother when they were girls, tales that made my mother seem like a real person instead of a ghost haunting our kitchen. My father never came to Ruthie's. I didn't understand why until much later. There was a mystery in the space between Ruth and my parents. They'd had some falling out before I was born, something my mother never discussed and my father refused to acknowledge. Ruth would go quiet when I asked, her eyes going distant, and then she'd change the subject with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I learned not to push. But I knew this, Ruth was the only adult who ever told me I was worthy of love without having to earn it first. At 18, I enlisted in the Army. It wasn't a decision born of patriotism or adventure. It was arithmetic. I wanted to be a doctor, but my family had no college money for me. My father told me that was my own problem to solve. My mother handed me $40 on the morning I left for basic training, then took 20 back and whispered not to tell my father. It was the most interaction we'd had in years. My father called my enlistment disgraceful. A woman joining the military, he said, was an admission that she couldn't find a husband to take care of her. I didn't bother arguing. I'd stopped arguing with him years ago. Ruth drove me to the recruiter's bus. She brought a shoebox full of cookies, chocolate chip, my favorite, and hugged me so tight I thought my ribs would crack. "You aren't leaving family," she told me. "You're taking it with you." I believed her. It was the only belief that got me through basic training, through combat medic school, through the long nights when I was exhausted and lonely and wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. I carried Ruth's voice in my head like a compass: sit down, eat, your family. I became a medic because it was the closest I could get to medicine without a degree. The army would train me, and I'd learn to save lives the only way I knew how, by being useful, by being the hands. It was the same role I'd played my whole life, just with a uniform and a different stage. In 2016, when I was 22 and stationed in Germany, my mother called me. Her voice was thin and tight in a way I'd learned to recognize. She told me my father's shop roof had collapsed during a spring storm, and they couldn't afford the repairs. She didn't ask for help. She simply described the problem and went quiet, the way she'd always done, letting the silence do the work. I set up a $1,500 monthly allotment from my pay. It was supposed to be temporary, a few months, my mother said, just until we're back on our feet. 10 years later, I was still paying it. Over that decade, I sent $180,000 to my family. Every emergency got packaged the same way: my mother's health or my father's business or my sister's latest ambition, with the same implied promise that this time would be the last. I never got a thank you. I never got a receipt. I just got the next request, delivered with the same careful guilt. I capped the amount eventually. I refused to co-sign loans. I set boundaries that I'd learned to set in the military: clear, enforceable, professional. But I kept the money flowing because cutting it off wouldn't hurt my father. It would hurt my mother. And whatever else she was, my mother was still the woman who'd held me when I was sick and made me soup and taught me to braid my hair. I didn't understand, then, that I was paying for love that had never been offered for free. My defining moment came in a dry riverbed in Afghanistan. We were on a convoy, the kind of routine movement that should have been boring. My team had done this route a dozen times. We knew the terrain, the threats, the patterns. We knew exactly what to expect, which meant we didn't expect anything. The second truck hit a buried charge at 1,417 hours. I remember the time because I was looking at my watch, calculating the distance to the checkpoint. Then the world went white and loud and everything I'd been trained to do became automatic. The Ridge opened fire immediately, small arms, maybe RPGs, I didn't have time to identify exactly. My training took over. I was out of the vehicle before the dust settled, running toward the burning truck with my aid bag slapping against my thigh. Specialist Dale Hutchins was 19 years old. He outweighed me by 40 pounds with all his gear, and he was trapped under a piece of the vehicle's armor. I pulled him out first because he was closest and because he was screaming, and I couldn't think about anything except the sound he was making. Then I went back into the smoke for Ramirez. Then again for the others. I became the only medic standing for 11 minutes. It felt like hours. I treated 4 wounded soldiers, kept them talking, kept them breathing. I asked Hutchins about his mother's cookies. He'd mentioned them once in passing, and I remembered, and I kept asking because every answer he gave meant he was still conscious, still alive, still with me. All 4 made it home alive. I didn't tell my parents about that night. There was no bill attached to it, no request they could fulfill or ignore. I knew they wouldn't ask, and I was tired of telling stories to people who only listened long enough to find a way to use them. In the spring of 2026, I got word that my Silver Star had been approved. It was the second highest award for valor in the military, the kind of recognition that meant my career was made. I was 32 years old, a non-commissioned officer with a resume that would open doors for the rest of my life. I should have been thrilled. Instead, I called my mother. The phone rang 5 times before she picked up. Her voice was the same as always, quiet, careful, like she was afraid of being overheard. Yolanda? Is everything okay? I got a medal, I said. The Silver Star. There's going to be a ceremony at the Pentagon in a few weeks. They're inviting family. Oh, she said. Then, does it come with money? I closed my eyes. No, Mom. It doesn't come with money. There was a pause. I could hear my father's voice in the background, asking what I wanted, why I was calling so late. My mother answered him with something I couldn't make out. Then she came back on the line. Your sister wants to know about cameras. If you're going to be on TV, she wants to know if she can tag you on social media. Brittany. Of course. My sister, who had built a brand around being the face of the family while I was bleeding in a riverbed. Now she smelled opportunity. Dad wants to know about VIP invitations, my mother continued. He has a church board member who might be able to help the shop if they meet some important people. I stood in my living room in Texas, staring at the wall, feeling the familiar weight of being invisible. Nobody had asked what happened. Nobody had asked if I was okay. Nobody wanted to hear the story of the burning truck or the 11 minutes that had changed me forever. They wanted to know what my medal was worth. That night, I finally did the math. My house fund, a savings account I'd been building for years, meant for a down payment on a farmhouse, had been hemorrhaging money. The goal was $60,000. The balance was $19,000. I started adding up the withdrawals. $25,000 for Brittany's failed brand launch, a loan she'd promised to repay after her influencer career took off. $8,000 for a lumber order for Dad's shop. $3,000 for my mother's dental surgery. $500 here, $1,000 there, every request sliding into the account and disappearing. The bridge loan at day 500 and counting. Every request had been promised back. Every promise had dissolved with the same shrug, the same words, we're family. Why are you keeping score? I should have stopped then. I should have closed the account and walked away. But I was still planning to fly them all to Washington, business class for Dad, because he'd complained about his back on the last flight they'd taken, a pool for Brittany, because she wanted to make a weekend of it and turn the ceremony into content. I heard Ruth's voice in my head, hope is the last bill you stop paying. I kept paying. 2 weeks before the ceremony, I drove to Millbrook. It was an 8-hour drive from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, where I was stationed. I could have flown, but I needed the time alone, the hum of the highway and the rhythm of the miles to prepare myself for what I knew was coming. I stopped at Ruthie's first. The diner looked exactly the same as it had when I was 8 years old. Same red vinyl booths, same jukebox in the corner, same smell of coffee and bacon and something sweet baking in the back. The screen door whined when I pushed it open, and Ruth appeared from the kitchen with a dish towel over her shoulder. She was in her 70s now, her hair white and her face lined with years of hard work, but her eyes were the same, warm and steady and seeing everything. She hugged me without a word because she already knew why I was there. I'm going to talk to them, I said. She nodded. I know, honey. I looked at the corkboard behind the register. It was crowded with photographs of soldiers, dozens of them, my platoon and others, holding cookies and letters and smiling. Ruth called them her kids. She'd been sending care packages for years, handwritten notes to lonely troops across 3 duty stations and 2 war zones. Every soldier who passed through that diner became part of her family. I didn't understand the full scope of what she'd done until much later. Sit down, Ruth said. Eat something first. I sat at the counter and let her feed me. It was the first peace I'd felt in weeks. At my parents' house, nothing had changed. The same furniture, the same photographs on the wall, the same silence that had always felt like judgment. My father was in his chair in the living room, a newspaper open on his lap that he wasn't reading. My mother was in the kitchen, her hands moving over dishes that were already clean. I presented the invitation and the seat cards. There's going to be a ceremony in Washington. I'd like you both to come. Front row, 2 seats. My father didn't touch the cards. He looked at them like they were contaminated. Then he started talking. He told me the town was asking questions. What was it like having a daughter who chose strangers over her own blood? The shop was dying, and people looked at him sideways. They wondered what kind of father raises a daughter who runs off to war and forgets where she came from. I'd heard all of this before. It was the same script he'd been reading my entire life, the same accusations dressed up in slightly different words. But this time, he was aiming for something bigger. Your sister had to explain to the church ladies that you're not a disgrace, he said. She had to tell them you were just confused, that you'd find your way back to your family eventually. I didn't respond. I was waiting for the punchline, the moment where he'd finally say something I could use. It came. We'll never stand beside you, he said. You're this family's biggest shame. He slid the cards back across the table. My mother wiped a dry plate and said nothing. She never said anything. I picked up the cards and said, okay. I could have argued. I could have told him about the riverbed and the machine gun fire and the 11 minutes that had earned me a place in Pentagon history. I could have described the look on Specialist Hutchins's face when he realized he was going to live. I could have reminded him that I'd been paying their bills for 10 years while he was telling the town I'd abandoned them. I did none of those things. Some debts can't be collected with words. That night, I went back to Ruthie's. Ruth was closing up when I arrived. She took one look at my face and led me to the corner booth, the one that had been her father's when he'd first opened the diner decades ago. She poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from me. Tell me, she said. I told her everything. Not just about the invitation and my father's rejection, but about the 24 years before that. The plaque locked in a drawer. The silence at the dinner table. The way my mother had always chosen my father's comfort over my happiness. The slow, grinding awareness that I had never once been loved for who I was, only for what I could provide. Ruth listened the way she always did, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug, her eyes steady on mine. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. 25 years ago, she finally said, your father's shop was going under. He came to me for money. Jean and I had saved everything we had for a house, every dollar, every dream. He needed $10,000 to keep the doors open. She paused, and I saw something in her face I'd never seen before. Something old and wounded and carefully buried. I lent it to him, she said. No papers, no interest, because family is family. He paid back some, maybe $4,000, and then he stopped. He stopped looking at me when he saw me at the grocery store. He stopped coming to my father's birthday dinners. Eventually, Jean and I weren't welcome at your family's table anymore. I stared at her. Why didn't you tell me? Because you were just a little girl, she said. You didn't need to carry that weight. But I'm telling you now because you need to understand something, honey. Your father can't forgive anyone who's seen him small. And you've seen him small your whole life. She reached across the table and took my hand. He didn't turn you down because of what you did. He turned you down because of what you are, someone who made a life without his permission, someone who succeeded in ways he never could. You remind him that he failed. And he'll never forgive you for that. I sat in that booth and let the truth settle into my bones. It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to me about my father. The seats are yours, I said. You and Jean. If you want them. Ruth shook her head. Those seats should be your family's. They're yours, I said. The guest form is still blank. I can put anyone I want on those cards. I want you. She fought me for 2 days. She insisted the seats belonged to my father, that I'd regret giving them away, that family was family no matter what. But I told her the story I'd never told anyone. In the riverbed, under machine gun fire, the voice my brain reached for wasn't a drill sergeant's or my mother's or God's. It was hers. Sit down, eat, your family. You don't owe anybody for loving you, she finally said. That's not how love works. That's how bills work. I opened my laptop at the counter and typed Ruth Fairbanks and Jean Fairbanks into the guest form fields. I pressed send. The cursor blinked at me. The names stayed. The next 2 weeks were a campaign. My family hadn't bothered to contact me in years except to ask for money. Now my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Brittany texted that I was humiliating everyone, that the town was talking, that I needed to fix this immediately. My father was supposedly devastated, though he couldn't bring himself to call me directly. Church ladies called about forgiveness. They'd heard I was going to snub my parents publicly, and they wanted me to understand the importance of honoring my father and mother. My mother cried softly on the phone and asked me to fix it. Please, Yolanda. Just fix it. Nobody asked my father to take back what he'd said. Nobody asked him to apologize. The entire system organized itself around getting the injured party to absorb the injury quietly, the way I'd always done. I didn't answer the calls. I didn't respond to the texts. I just let them come and felt something shift inside me, the tectonic plates of my identity sliding into a new configuration. Then, 10 days before the ceremony, everything changed. Captain Reyes called me into her office. The Pentagon's moving the event to a larger auditorium, she said. There's going to be a live national broadcast. You'll be delivering remarks, and your guest list is now locked in the Pentagon database. I nodded, not understanding the significance. Okay. She pulled up my manifest and read the names aloud. When she got to Ruth Fairbanks, she smiled mysteriously. You'll find out at the ceremony, she said. I didn't ask what she meant. I was too tired to hope. What I didn't know was that 5 months earlier, Sergeant Major Alvarez had noticed Ruth's letters. He'd seen the boxes of cookies and the handwritten notes, the way she'd adopted my whole platoon as her own. He'd seen how she remembered birthdays and deployment dates and the names of soldiers' pets. He'd seen her show up, week after week, year after year, for 14 years of extraordinary voluntary service. People get medals for less courage than 14 years of showing up, he'd said. We'd submitted Ruth for a civilian award. I'd filled out the paperwork, heard it was approved, and promptly forgotten about it in the chaos of training and deployment and life. The Army hadn't forgotten. The Outstanding Civilian Service Medal was in process, and Ruth was going to receive it at the same ceremony where I'd receive my Silver Star. I wouldn't find out until I was on stage. 1 week before the ceremony, I took 3 actions. First, I terminated the $1,500 monthly allotment that had run for 10 years. It was a simple phone call, a few clicks in a system, the severing of a financial lifeline that had cost me more than money. I didn't feel the relief I'd expected. I just felt a quiet certainty that I'd done the right thing. Second, I changed my DD Form 93, the emergency data record that tells the military who to contact if something happens to me. For years, I'd listed my parents as the primary contacts. Now I changed it to Ruth. It was a small thing, but it felt enormous. I thought, if I died tomorrow, the Army would knock on the door of the person who would actually cry. Third, I locked the guest manifest. There was no going back. When I walked to my truck, the weight on my shoulders felt lighter for the first time in decades. 2 days after I canceled the allotment, my father called. He'd never called me first in my entire adult life. I stared at the phone for 3 rings, considering whether to answer. I did, because I needed to hear what he'd say. The money didn't come, he said. No greeting, no preamble. Just the accusation. I know, I said. We need it. The shop. The shop has needed it for 10 years, I said. I'm done. There was a long silence. Then, surprisingly, he dropped it. He didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He just went quiet, the way he always did when he was regrouping for a new approach. It was the cameras, not the missing money, that finally made my family reach out. Mr. Hendricks from the church board announced at a men's breakfast that Yolanda Farrell was receiving the Silver Star on national television. The news spread through Millbrook like a shockwave. The grocery store hung a flag. The mayor called my father to offer congratulations. Suddenly, the daughter who embarrassed the family became the crown jewel. Brittany called, her voice dripping with sugar. Yolanda. I just heard about the broadcast. How many viewers will there be? Can I be on camera with you? Everyone's so proud. I understood with total clarity. I hadn't changed in their eyes. Only my price had. Then my mother sent a letter. 4 pages, the first she'd ever written me. Her handwriting was small and precise, the same careful script she'd used on birthday cards when I was a child. She wrote that Dad wasn't sleeping, that the shop was failing, that a man watching his legacy come apart says things he doesn't mean. Folded inside the letter was a photograph of me at 6 years old, sitting on my father's shoulders at the county fair. We were both laughing. I remembered that day, the smell of fried dough and the way the world looked from so high up. It was one of the few happy memories I had of him. I called Ruth and read her the letter. I told her about the photograph, about the 6-year-old girl who still believed her father loved her. Ruth asked one question, "Honey, if the cameras weren't coming, would that letter exist?" I couldn't answer. 2 days before the ceremony, I flew to Washington. The city was beautiful in the spring, the cherry blossoms in full bloom, the monuments gleaming in the sun. I should have been excited. Instead, I felt like I was walking toward a funeral. I checked into my hotel, went through the motions of preparing for the ceremony, and tried not to think about the empty seats in the front row. Ruth and Jean were flying in the next morning. I'd see them at the Pentagon, and that would be enough. It wasn't enough, and I knew it. But it was all I had. That evening, I was in the hotel lobby when my family appeared. They'd driven 600 miles from Millbrook without telling me. My father was in his church suit, the same one he wore to funerals and weddings and the rare occasions when he needed to look respectable. My mother was in her best dress, a floral print she'd worn to my high school graduation. Brittany was in designer clothes, her phone already out, filming the lobby for her social media. I felt something cold settle in my chest. "Yolanda," my father said. His voice was warm, conciliatory. It was the voice he used with customers and church board members. "We've come to make things right." He proposed a deal. He'd sit in the front row, tell the reporters he was proud of me, show the world that the Farrells were whole. In return, I'd restart the monthly money, let Brittany document the weekend for her followers, and forget all the unpleasantness. No apology. Just amnesty, retroactive, with interest payable monthly. For 3 seconds, the 6-year-old on his shoulders believed him. I remembered the county fair, the laughter, the feeling of being held. I remembered the photograph my mother had sent, and I wanted to believe it still meant something. Then my father's voice cracked. It was only 10 seconds, a brief moment of vulnerability where I saw him plain, a 63-year-old man drowning in a town-sized aquarium, raised by a father who never shook his hand. He was desperate and scared and drowning, and for just a moment, he let me see it. My hand moved toward his sleeve. He caught himself. He hated that I'd witnessed it, and the scaffolding went back up. His face hardened, his back straightened, and he looked at me with the same cold eyes I'd seen my whole life. "You owe this family that much," he said. I asked him one question. My voice was level, calm. "If there were no cameras tomorrow, Dad, would you be standing in this lobby?" Silence. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He stood there in his church suit, surrounded by his family, and he had no answer. That silence was the most honest thing he'd said in 20 years. "The seats are taken," I said. "I spent my whole life buying a seat at your table. I'm done. My table's full." My father detonated. "Ungrateful," he spat. "Selfish. You'll regret this. You'll come crawling back when you realize what you've thrown away." But I felt calm. I stepped backward into the elevator and rode up alone, the doors closing on his mid-sentence and my mother's face. My mother's face. I'd forgotten to look at her. I'd been so focused on my father that I'd forgotten the one person who'd always been collateral damage. I didn't go back down. The next morning, I put on my dress uniform. Class A's, with all the ribbons and the jump wings and the combat patch. I'd worn them dozens of times, but never like this. Never on a stage in front of cameras and generals and the eyes of the nation. Ruth and Jean were in the front row, right where I'd placed them. Ruth wore a blue dress I'd never seen before, with the kind of careful dignity that came from a lifetime of hard work. Jean sat beside her, his white hair trimmed, his hands folded in his lap. The citation was read. The riverbed, the burning vehicle, 11 minutes, for soldiers alive. A 3-star general pinned the silver star to my chest, and I saluted, and the auditorium erupted. I should have felt proud. Instead, I felt like I was watching someone else. Then the Master of Ceremonies announced an additional item not in the program. The Undersecretary of the Army walked out with a leather folder. He read, for 14 years of extraordinary voluntary service, for hundreds of care packages, for handwritten correspondence with soldiers who had no one else, the Department of the Army awards the Outstanding Civilian Service Medal to Ruth Fairbanks. Ruth rose in her blue dress. She gripped the rail, climbed into the lights of a live national broadcast, and walked to the stage like she'd been doing it her whole life. The entire auditorium stood. The battalion, the brass, the press. The general pinned the medal below her collarbone and gave her a walnut case containing a flag that had flown over the Pentagon that morning in her honor. She looked at me. Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. I stepped to the podium. I'm told courage runs in families, I said. Mine ran a diner in Ohio. The camera found Ruth laughing and crying, holding that flag like she was holding a stretcher. My phone stayed dark through the reception. When Ruth finally nodded at my jacket and told me to look at it, I stepped into the corridor. 49 missed calls, 17 from Dad, 21 from Mom, 11 from Brittany, plus a stack of texts. The clip had reached Millbrook's community Facebook group. The town had watched the diner lady on the Pentagon stage, the standing ovation, and 2 front-row chairs labeled Family of the Honoree, with names everyone in town knew were not my parents. My parents had been accepting sidewalk congratulations for 2 weeks, claiming they'd be sitting there. I listened to 3 voicemails. Brittany was shrieking about damage control. How could I do this to her? How could I destroy her brand like this? She was going to have to spend weeks fixing the narrative. Dad started in his shop machine voice, cold and clipped. He was telling me I'd ruined everything, that I'd made him a laughingstock, that I'd pay for this. Then he stopped mid-sentence. There was a long breath, and the call ended. From him, that was practically a soliloquy. Then Mom. Almost a whisper. I watched it, Yolanda. Ruth looked beautiful. You look like yourself. I stood in that corridor for a long time. Then I typed one text to Mom, my door isn't locked, but it isn't an ATM anymore. And it never will be again. You know where I am. I turned off the phone, went back in, and ate cake with my family. Months have passed. The flag flies framed at Ruthie's, walnut case open, medal beside it, next to the corkboard of soldier photos. The local paper did a story, and now there's a line out the door on Saturdays. Jean built a hand-carved sign over the corner booth, family table, reserved for whoever shows up. I ate Thanksgiving there, on my old stool, and nobody billed me for it. In Millbrook, my father still tells his version at the coffee counter. How the army filled the seats, how it was all politics, how his daughter was manipulated by people who didn't understand family. The town lets him talk like a radio playing in another room. The shop sold the big planer and survives, smaller. I didn't do that to him, and I didn't save him from it. Learning the difference between those 2 sentences cost me 24 years. My mother writes me a letter every month now. Real ones, no photographs or requests enclosed. She tells me about the garden she started in the backyard and the book club she's joined and the way the light falls through the kitchen window in the afternoons. She never mentions money. She never mentions my father. I answer every one. We haven't seen each other yet. Her door and mine are both unlocked, and I've stopped being the only one responsible for the walking. Brittany rebranded. She started a new series about healing from family estrangement, filmed in the kitchen my money renovated. She's got 60,000 followers now. I muted her. The $1,500 allotment now goes into my house fund. It crossed $30,000 last week. There's a farmhouse 20 minutes from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, that I drive past on Sundays. It has a porch that would fit a swing. I train young combat medics now. Last month, a private with shaking hands asked how I stay calm under fire. I gave her the true answer: you get very clear on exactly who you're fighting to get home to. And you make sure the list is accurate. Because carrying the wrong names into combat is heavier than any rucksack. Family was never the people who share your blood. It's the people who stand beside you when standing costs them something. That's my story. 1 refused invitation, 2 seats with the right names on them, and 49 calls that came exactly 1 broadcast too late. The silver star still weighs more than you'd think. But I've learned to carry it.